I'm going to go ahead and start our formal presentation because I want to make sure to make good use of our guests' time. I want to welcome everyone who's logged in to the National Security Policy Speaker Series. I want to remind you that this is a recorded event, so please make the settings on your version of the social media platform, Zoom, make sure that they're what you want them to be. The National Security Policy Speaker Series is hosted by the Center for Peace and Security Studies at UCSD. It's co-sponsored by the Korean Pacific Program and by the Nonproliferation Policy Education Center, NPAC, in Washington, D.C. The speakers include policymakers and actors who operate within the national security space. Topics include cybersecurity, weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, region-specific security talks, and more. If you'd like to be added to the speaker series listserv, please email questions to cpass@ucsd.edu. A few considerations before we begin the talk. You should have been muted, your mic should have been muted when you logged into the talk. If for some reason you have not, please mute yourself. It's going to improve the reception. You're going to hear things much better. Everyone's going to benefit. Save your questions for after the presentation. There will be a designated Q&A period, and our speaker will be happy, I'm sure, to field questions at that time. During the Q&A session, use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen and send a message with only your name to the speaker. Okay, there's an option for doing that. Your name will be called on in the order received. Okay, with those formalities out of the way, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Gary Samone. He is the Crown Family Director and Professor of Politics at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. And today he's going to speak with us on living with the North Korean bomb. Dr. Gary Samone, thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eric, and thanks to everybody for joining us in virtual reality. I apologize for not being able to speak to all of you directly, but hopefully this will at least provide us with an opportunity to discuss an important subject. Christine is going to manage my slides. I've learned from experience that in these Zoom presentations, it's always a good idea to have a slideshow. So Christine, let's put up the title slide, please. So my title really says it all. I think we've passed the point where elimination of North Korean weapons and missile programs are practical near term. That doesn't mean that we should give up. We should continue to pursue denuclearization as a long-term objective. But for the time being, we're going to have to manage a nuclear-armed North Korea, as we have for over it, really, since North Korea conducted its first nuclear test in 2006. And that means preventing war and use of nuclear weapons, limiting to the extent possible North Korea's nuclear and missile capabilities through diplomacy, and finally preventing further proliferation in the region. So I'm going to focus on three main topics. First, the status of North Korea's nuclear and missile programs, as best we know. Secondly, I want to just briefly talk about why diplomacy has failed over the last 50 years to prevent North Korea from acquiring nuclear weapons. And then once they acquired nuclear weapons, our inability to achieve rollback. And finally, I'm going to talk about policy options going forward. Next slide, please. So the first thing to say about the status of North Korea's nuclear weapons program is that there's a great deal we don't know. That's, of course, true both the public domain as well as classified information available to the US intelligence agencies. Now, I should mention that since I've left the government in 2013, I haven't had access to classified information, so there may be more than I'm aware of. Of course, there are some things I'm aware of that I'm not able to talk about, but I'm going to try to focus on the areas where we have huge uncertainties. First and foremost are the stocks of fissile material, plutonium and highly enriched uranium, that North Korea has available for its nuclear weapons program. On the plutonium side, we can make a rough estimate within reasonable bounds of uncertainty about how much plutonium North Korea could have produced, because all of their plutonium comes from the small 5-megawatt reactor at Yongbyon. We can make calculations about the production of plutonium in that reactor based on hours of operation and the size of the fuel load, and estimates of how much the plutonium the North Koreans could have recovered through reprocessing. The North Koreans themselves declared to the United States in 2007 that they had produced 37 kilograms of plutonium. That's at the lower end of the US estimate. So something in the order of 40 to 50 kilograms is a reasonable estimate, without knowing, of course, how much plutonium the North Koreans might have used in their nuclear tests. But on the highly enriched uranium side, the areas of uncertainty are really dramatic. We don't know for sure when North Korea first began producing highly enriched uranium, and we don't really know the production capacity of the facilities, of the enrichment facilities in North Korea, in particular the covert facilities. So there's huge margins of error on how much fissile material North Korea has available for producing nuclear weapons. And as a consequence, because we don't know the total amount of material, and we don't know how much fissile material is used in each type of nuclear device, it's very hard to estimate how many nuclear weapons North Korea actually has. I'm comfortable saying a couple of dozen, but I think trying to be more precise than that, I think is really hard, to be very accurate given all the uncertainties. In terms of force structure, that is the mating of nuclear weapons with the ballistic missile force, again, we have huge areas of uncertainty, partly because North Korea's conventionally armed missiles are intermingled with their nuclear armed missiles, especially at the short and medium range. So the North Koreans have many more deployed Scud-type missiles and no-dawn missiles than they probably have armed with nuclear weapons. And it's very difficult, of course, to distinguish whether a missile is armed with conventional or nuclear warhead. It's reasonable to assume that the longer range systems, the intermediate range and the ICBM range systems, are intended primarily for nuclear delivery as opposed to short range and intermediate range. But our knowledge about the deployment capacity, as I'll discuss, of those longer range systems is really very skimpy. And finally, in terms of how does North Korea think about its nuclear weapons, again, we can speculate based on North Korean public statements that their primary objective is to deter their enemies. That's certainly what their public statements have emphasized. But we don't know how North Korea sees its use of nuclear weapons as a way to deter enemies like the United States. And if North Korea was forced to use nuclear weapons, we obviously don't have a good knowledge of what their targeting strategy would be. One presumes that their weapons are primarily designed as counter-value weapons, that is, to threaten cities, but we don't know that for sure. Next slide, please. So this is just to remind us of the pattern of North Korean nuclear tests, the date of the test, and the estimated yield, which is based on interpretation of seismic data. And there's, as you can see, a reasonable range of uncertainty, but there is a pattern. The first two tests were very low yield based on seismic evidence, which suggests that the North Koreans may have been working on perfecting the implosion design that they no doubtedly use for their first generation nuclear devices. And then they had 3 tests in a row, roughly the same yield, which suggests that they have been able to achieve a stable design with reliable results in terms of yield. Some people believe that these 3 tests in that period included both plutonium-based and uranium-based devices, but in the absence of being able to collect plume data from those tests, they were all underground, of course, and without being able to collect debris, atmospheric debris, it's not possible to come to a conclusion about what fissile material was used in those tests. And then finally, we have the major increase in yield in the September 2017 test, which the North Koreans said was a thermonuclear device. I think it's very plausible that it was a hydrogen bomb. Again, we don't know for sure, but to me, that's the most logical conclusion of the development process that North Koreans have been engaged in since they started conducting tests in 2006. Next slide, please. So here's, of course, all these pictures I'm going to show you, we don't know for sure that these artifacts that Kim is posing with are real, but they certainly have, to me, they certainly have plausibility, at least in terms of resembling the real thing. So here's Kim Jung Un with what looks like a standard implosion device with a multi-point detonation system, probably an external neutron generator. And it's of the size that you would expect from a country like North Korea that's early in the process of developing simple implosion devices. There's a pretty good reason to believe that North Korea acquired some nuclear weapons design information from Pakistan in the early 90s, when Pakistan acquired no-dome missiles from North Korea in exchange for centrifuge technology and possibly some highly enriched uranium and nuclear weapons design. And this device that's pictured here certainly has the external characteristics one would associate with a first generation implosion design. Next picture, please. This is Kim posing with what the North Korean that was tested in November 2017. Again, it has the right look of a 2-stage device with the primary in the back and the secondary in the front. And, you know, similar to early generation thermonuclear devices that all of the nuclear powers tested. Next device, please. Or next. Now I'm going to talk about missile development. I'm not going to focus on short range, Scud type, and no-dome medium range missile tests, which North Korea has been conducting since the 1980s. I'm going to focus more on the longer range systems because of their direct relevance to the United States and US deterrence. So it's important to remember that in the early years of North Korea's development of long-range missiles, they always characterized their work in terms of space launch vehicles. So these are rockets intended to launch satellites into space. And although the technology between space launch vehicles and long-range missiles is not absolutely identical, there's enough overlap, especially in terms of the booster, so that the North Koreans used, in my view, they used their development of peaceful space launch vehicles as a cover for developing technology they would eventually use in their longer range missile systems. And this is just a list of the space launch vehicle satellite launches that the North Koreans conducted, going back to the first Taepodong-1 test in August of 1993, which, by the way, led the Clinton administration at the time to decide to proceed with a national missile defense system that we still have with us today. Next slide, please. What is remarkable to me is that starting in 2016, Kim Jung Un ordered a really impressive series of tests. For the first time, North Korea openly testing intermediate range ballistic missiles, that is, missiles with a range of 3,000 to 5,500 kilometers, and ICBM range systems, missiles with a range over 5,500 kilometers. Before that, all of the tests have been either space launch vehicles or they've been short range or medium range no-dome type systems. It's really in 2016 that the North Koreans embark on this very aggressive, very intense testing series in order to demonstrate the ability to at least test longer range systems. Now, keep in mind, all of these tests are lofted trajectories. So the missiles are fired not the way they would normally be fired if they were to be actually used in wartime, but they're fired up into the air and then come down much shorter than the full range. So many of the range estimates are based on what people think the range would be if the missile was straightened out and launched to maximum capacity. Also keep in mind there's uncertainty about throw weight, that depending upon the weight of the reentry vehicle, the range would of course, change dramatically. So our knowledge about, even though we have relatively good understanding of the capabilities of these systems, there's still a lot of uncertainty depending upon what the launch trajectory would be and what the reentry vehicle weight would be. The main thing, I'm not going to talk about all these tests, the main thing is to see the pretty dramatic shift from a series of failed tests. The Musadan, which used an IRBM, which used a different engine and a more energetic liquid propellant, which failed very dramatically throughout 2016, missiles that exploded seconds after launch, in some cases killing the operators. The North Koreans shifted to a Hwasan 12, Mars 12, which used an engine more similar to the ones North Koreans have used and a propellant that they've used in the No-Dong series, and that has been more successful. And then finally, starting in July, the first test of an ICBM, in this case the Hwasan 14, which, if you, depending upon your range estimates, could probably reach or perhaps reach the western coast of the United States. And then the last test, the Hwasan 15 in November 17, which considered a true ICBM that could reach all of the United States. Next slide, please. In addition to these tests of longer range liquid fueled systems, which are all designed to be deployed as road mobile missiles, the North Koreans have also been developing solid fuel systems to be tested underwater by submarine. Now, most of these tests have taken place under, or perhaps all of them, have taken place not by submarines, but by underwater barges. But the North Koreans have demonstrated in the SLBM area a clear progress in terms of testing solid fuel systems. going from single stage systems, the Pukguksong or Polaris 1, to systems that have 2 stages, the Pukguksong 2 and 3. The ranges are still in the medium range, so under 3,000, but it's a clear demonstration, I think, that the North Koreans are proceeding or working on the development of longer range solid fuel submarine launched ballistic missiles. Next slide, please. So now I just have some pictures, and again, who knows what the actual deployment status is of these systems, how many of them are deployed, but they certainly make convincing pictures. So here's Kim posing with the Mars 14, the Hwasong 14, which is the long-range missile that has a fairly, notice it has a fairly small warhead section. So the speculation is that perhaps that's designed for delivering an implosion system. Notice it's mobile, although it's not tracked, so it would have to go to launch pads and then erect the missile. And of course, liquid fuel is very cumbersome, so the missile would have to be fueled before it could be fired. Next slide, please. Here's Kim posing with the Hwasong 15, which has a larger warhead section, and the speculation is that that might be intended to accommodate a thermonuclear warhead. But like the Hwasong 14, it's liquid fueled on a tracked vehicle, on a wheeled vehicle, has to be deployed on a launch pad and would presumably take some time before it could be ready to be fired. The deployment status of the Hwasong 15 is also uncertain. Next slide, please. And finally, this is just a nice picture of Kim Jung Un touring a factory where a submarine is being built. You can see it's a pretty big hall, and the speculation is that the North Koreans at some point would be interested in trying to build and deploy a submarine that could launch a handful, maybe 1 or 2 submarine launched ballistic missiles. Next slide. So the important point I want to emphasize here is that North Korea, like all nuclear weapons states, there's a very strong strategic logic in achieving an assured second strike capability. In other words, in order to be able to absorb a preemptive strike from your enemy and still have sufficient nuclear forces left over for retaliation. Assuming that the US is the primary enemy that might launch a preemptive strike, the North Koreans, just like the Russians and the Chinese, are proceeding down the same technological path. So that means road mobile missiles versus silo-based. Obviously, road mobile are more difficult to detect and track and preemptively destroy. It means pursuit of solid fuel over liquid fuel, because solid fuel can be much quicker to deploy and to fire than liquid fuel, and there's much less of a baggage train that makes it vulnerable to preemption. Presumably, I don't have any evidence of this, but presumably the North Koreans are looking at penetration aids in order to overcome US missile defense, just as the Russians and Chinese have done. And some penetration aid technology is relatively unsophisticated. These are ways of putting in the warhead dummy warheads that can confuse and make it more difficult for missile defense to attack the real warhead. And then finally, the North Koreans are clearly looking to go to sea with submarine launched ballistic missiles, just as the Russians and the Chinese have done. Now, obviously, the North Koreans don't have the same resources as the Chinese and the Russians, and presumably it will take them longer to acquire these more advanced capabilities. And presumably at the end of the day, their forces won't be as formidable as the Chinese and the Russians. But I think the long-term trend for North Korea, the only thing that makes sense if they want to have a credible nuclear deterrent, is to try to have the capacity to withstand a US preemptive strike and overcome US missile defense in order to credibly threaten the US and US allies. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through each of these, but the slide is intended to remind us that all US presidents, since President Reagan, when I first joined the government, have tried to prevent North Korea from acquiring nuclear weapons or have tried to roll back North Korea's nuclear weapons program, and all of them have failed. And we've tried many different diplomatic approaches. In the Reagan administration, our emphasis was on working with the Soviet Union to convince North Korea to join the Nonproliferation Treaty, which North Korea did in December 1985, although they dragged their feet on completing their safeguards agreement with the IAEA. In the meantime, the Bush administration pursued a north-south approach, commitments on the part of both North and South Korea not to have nuclear weapons and not to build fuel cycle enrichment and reprocessing technologies. I was very much involved in those negotiations, which ultimately broke down over disputes about verification, about what kind of mutual inspections were possible. In the meantime, the North Koreans completed their safeguards agreement under the Clinton administration, but very quickly it was clear that they had, to the IAEA, that they had not fully declared plutonium they had produced prior to the agreement. That led to North Korea's first threat to leave the NPT, and then lengthy negotiations between the US and the DPRK, where I led the US technical level talks, and that produced a bilateral agreement on the US DPRK agreed framework, which froze North Korea plutonium production for more than 6 years. But the North Koreans cheated on the agreement by pursuing a clandestine enrichment program based on the technology they had acquired from Pakistan. That led to the collapse of the agreed framework. And then the Bush administration tried a different approach, which was a multilateral approach. 6-party talks led to a series of agreements. Some progress was made, but the talks ultimately broke down over North Korea's refusal to acknowledge its enrichment, its clandestine enrichment program. The Obama administration also tried several times to negotiate agreements with North Korea and agreed to a very modest deal, leap day deal, in February of 2012, which fell apart very quickly when North Korea broke the agreement by conducting a satellite launch. Now, all of these, I would say that these various agreements by presidents before President Trump did achieve some success in limiting or delaying North Korea's acquisition of nuclear weapons through either test moratoriums, missile test moratoriums, or limits on production of fissile material. But at the end of the day, they did not succeed. And the record so far of President Trump's effort is very similar. President Trump, unlike all previous presidents, has been willing to meet directly with Kim Jung Un. So we have a summit level approach, which is an interesting innovation, but it hasn't produced very concrete results beyond the moratorium on nuclear and long range missile testing, which I think is important in terms of limiting North Korea's capability, but of course is a long way toward denuclearization. We can talk more about the Trump policy if people are interested. Basically, the Singapore summit, President Trump and Chairman Kim Jung Un, that should be June of 2018, they agreed to a very general statement in which North Korea made general commitments toward denuclearization, not very different from commitments they've made many times in the past. But the effort to try to translate that general commitment into concrete actions really ran into a failure in the Hanoi summit in June of 2019, in which North Korea offered a very limited step of dismantling Yongbyon in exchange for lifting nearly all of the sanctions, international sanctions that had been imposed since 2016. And the Trump administration offered a much more comprehensive plan for denuclearization, declarations, dismantlement of facilities, inspections, in exchange for sanctions relief that would come at the very end. And the Hanoi meeting failed to reach an agreement. And since then, there's really been no progress toward agreement on practical steps toward denuclearization. Next slide, please. So why has diplomacy failed? Why have the last 6 presidents failed to achieve their nonproliferation objectives with North Korea? So I think of this in a very simple way, that North Korea's motivations have been much stronger than the inducements and pressure and threats that the US and its allies have been able to bring to bear. On the motivation side, I think the North Koreans really, since Kim Il-sung, who founded the nation and started the nuclear weapons program, his son and his grandson, Kim Jong-il and Kim Jung Un, have seen nuclear weapons as really essential to the survival of the North Korean state. And so as a consequence, the inducements that the US and its allies have offered have not been sufficient to overcome that existential need the North Koreans see for nuclear weapons. On inducements, the US and its allies have offered everything from heavy fuel oil to nuclear energy to rice to cash to security assurances. And these inducements, as I've said, have been able to achieve some limits and constraints on North Korea's nuclear weapons program, but we've never been able to satisfy North Korea's security needs. And in particular, the US and the ROK have never offered to end the security alliance, to remove US troops. I'm not even sure that would be sufficient for North Korea, but we've certainly never tested the question of whether the abandonment of the US-ROK alliance would be sufficient. On the pressure and threat side, the US ability to pressure North Korea through international sanctions is limited because of the nature of the North Korean regime and from the protection that China has provided North Korea from economic sanctions that might lead to instability. On the threat side, the credibility of US threats to attack North Korea, to destroy its nuclear facilities, are obviously very limited, even in the early days of the program, because of the concern that that could lead to a broader conflict, which would inflict tremendous damage on US allies, in particular South Korea. So the ability of the US to use coercive diplomacy in pursuit of nonproliferation has been limited. And finally, just to emphasize the verification challenge, that as the magnitude of North Korea's nuclear and missile programs have grown, in particular as North Korea has moved from plutonium to enrichment, as they've expanded their missile force, they've gone from silo to mobile missiles, the challenge of having an effective verification system in order to monitor any agreement has become extremely large and difficult to imagine that North Korea, given the nature of the regime, would be willing to cooperate with the kind of intrusive inspections that would be necessary to monitor an agreement. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide. I'm just going to be very brief. So going forward, I think we have 3 fundamental objectives. The first is to prevent use of nuclear weapons. And I think that means primarily preventing military conflict on the Korean Peninsula that could potentially escalate to a nuclear scenario. Now, of course, part of reducing the risk of conflict is diplomacy, confidence building measures, improving relations. All of that is important. But at the end of the day, I really think it's a question of deterrence. And fortunately, the US and the ROK have a tremendous conventional advantage over North Korea. North Korea still has the capacity to damage Seoul with short-range artillery and rockets, but in terms of the development of South Korea's conventional weapons over the last couple of decades, more advanced weapons, there's still a tremendous advantage. And I think that will help to deal with any North Korean temptation to use its nuclear shield to try to engage in conventional provocations to pressure South Korea. Secondly, as I mentioned, even though I think denuclearization is not a practical diplomatic objective, I think we can still try to negotiate limits that will constrain and perhaps delay North Korea's development of its capabilities. And the current constraint, the missile and nuclear weapon test moratorium that President Trump has put in place, I think is very important to try to continue, because without additional long-range missile testing, North Korea's ability to actually deliver a nuclear weapon to the US, I think, is undemonstrated and questionable. And finally, it's important that the US prevent further proliferation in the region, in particular South Korea and Japan. I think in both countries, there are still very powerful domestic constituencies against acquisition of nuclear weapons, especially in Japan. But the key to dealing, or the key to relieving pressure on Tokyo and Seoul, I think, is to show that the US is committed to continuing working toward limiting and eventually eliminating North Korea's nuclear weapons, and maintaining the strength of the US alliance with the ROK and Japan. So I'm gonna, next slide, please. So that's it, and I'm very happy to answer questions.